Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the soft candlelit world of the Middle Ages, where the nights were long, the winters were longer, and the rules, well, they were sometimes confusing even by medieval standards. So get comfortable, let your shoulders relax, maybe dim the lights a little, and let's wander back through time together. We're settling into an era where people believed the moon caused madness, where nobles thought bathing too often might kill them, and where someone somewhere inevitably invented a law that sounds completely absurd now, but at the time felt like the only thing preventing society from collapsing into complete chaos. Which, to be fair, it usually was. Tonight's little journey is all about weird medieval rules. The ones that sound ridiculous, annoying, or vaguely cursed, but which actually existed for perfectly logical, if occasionally misguided reasons. Or at least, medievally logical reasons. You'll see what I mean soon enough. So let's drift in. The first thing to appreciate about medieval rules is that very few of them were written because someone thought, let's make life better for everyone. Instead, they were usually written because someone somewhere did something foolish, dangerous, socially inconvenient, or so catastrophically stupid that it simply had to be prevented from ever happening again. And since this was the Middle Ages, people had a remarkable gift for precisely that kind of behavior. For example, and you may have heard this whispered on some dusty documentary at 3 a.m., there were places in medieval Europe where you could be fined for eating gingerbread at the wrong time. Yes, gingerbread. A crime. Imagine being hauled before a magistrate, forced to explain that yes, you did in fact consume a cookie outside of the approved festival dates, and no, you didn't realize this was legally equivalent to stealing a goat. But of course, this wasn't just the Middle Ages being whimsical. The restriction existed because gingerbread was heavily associated with festivals, religious feasts, and town fairs. In other words, it was part of the local economy. Bakers controlled it. Guilds controlled it. The church controlled it. And if people started munching gingerbread on any random Tuesday, well, there went the entire festival season economy. Medieval people might not have had electricity, but they absolutely had gatekeeping. You'll notice that pattern often. The rules were weird, yes, but they were also quietly enforcing a specific social order. Usually an order that benefited the people who wrote the rules. Shocking, I know. Another rule that often gets mentioned is the medieval ban on wearing certain colors if you weren't noble. And while that does sound like the kind of thing a medieval king might wake up and decide for fun, no purple unless your title begins with your grace. The real reason was a bit more practical and also extremely medieval. Dyes were expensive. The kind of expensive that makes modern designer brands quietly sweat. Some colors were so rare and difficult to produce that only the wealthiest elites could afford them. So naturally, the elites created laws to make sure no one else ever could, thus preventing any unwanted competition in the appearing important category. Imagine being a hardworking merchant who manages to save enough to buy a deep blue tunic, only to have a city official stop you in the street because your outfit is apparently too impressive for your income bracket. This was the medieval answer to fake it till you make it. Simply don't. Or we'll fine you. Or worse, confiscate your tunic, which was basically the medieval equivalent of confiscating your entire personality. These sumptuary laws, as they were called, were often enforced with surprising seriousness. Wearing the wrong color wasn't seen merely as a fashion crime. It was seen as social fraud. Pretending to be higher class than you were? Medieval society couldn't allow that. Meanwhile, pretending to know how to bathe properly was perfectly acceptable, even encouraged. And while we're on the topic of clothes, let's drift over to one of my personal favorites, the medieval laws regulating the length of shoes. There was quite genuinely a period in medieval Europe when men wore shoes with extremely long, pointed toes, sometimes over 2 feet long. Because of course they did. The longer the shoe, the more fashionable and wealthy you appeared, though you also appeared mildly confused and highly impractical. But that was part of the charm. These shoes, called polaines, got so out of hand that some cities had to pass laws limiting their length. Not because of fashion concerns. Oh no, but because these shoes were becoming a public safety hazard. You can imagine the scene. A group of noblemen attempting to descend a staircase, all in shoes long enough to double as medieval tent poles, all tripping over themselves like elegant, wealthy flamingos. After enough injuries, someone finally said, "Right, that's enough. 6 inches. That's the maximum." Yes, a literal shoe-length law. The official explanation? Modesty. The unofficial explanation? Too many nobles face-planting in public. But it wasn't all fashion and footwear. Medieval rules also governed things like sweat, smells, and the sudden need for quiet after dark. For instance, many towns enforced a strict rule at night involving something called the curfew bell. When the bell rang, it told residents to cover their fires. Literally, they were supposed to smother the flames, put out the candles, and settle in for the night. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, cover fire. And while it might sound controlling, this was actually a pretty sensible precaution when you live in a town where everything is made of wood and the firefighting equipment consists of buckets. Just buckets. If someone's cooking fire leapt out of control at 2 a.m., congratulations, half your town was gone by sunrise. Enforcing early fire covering wasn't about keeping people indoors. It was about keeping the buildings still standing. Of course, some people resented the curfew bell. There's always someone. The medieval equivalent of "you can't tell me what to do" usually involved muttering under your breath and ignoring the bell, which occasionally resulted in fires, fines, or a stern lecture from a town official who absolutely did not want to be awake at midnight dealing with your smoldering roof.
This brings us to another rule that seems strange today but made sense back then: the ban on nighttime wandering. People in medieval Europe were not supposed to be out at night unless they had a very good reason. Darkness wasn't just darkness. It was a combination of zero visibility, non-existent police, thieves, wolves, drunk students, and probably a few things locals swore were demons. If you were out walking around without a lantern, you weren't brave. You were a hazard to everyone, including yourself. So many towns passed laws requiring you to carry a lantern after dark, and if you didn't, the night watch could stop you and ask questions like, "Why are you wandering alone at midnight?" And "Are you up to something?" Or, "Are you sure you aren't just incredibly lost?" And more often than not, the answer to all three was yes. Many of these rules had the same theme: keeping the peace, keeping the structure, preventing bad ideas from becoming worse ideas. And speaking of bad ideas made worse, let's drift for a moment toward something that medieval people were surprisingly strict about: bread. Bread was the backbone of medieval diets. Without bread, peasants starved, and nobles complained loudly because their meals suddenly didn't feel complete. So many regions enacted something called the assize of bread, which regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread. Bakers who cheated customers by selling underweight loaves, using subpar grains, or adding questionable filler ingredients could be fined or punished. Some towns had punishments that were incredibly direct. One method was called the pillory, where the baker would be locked into a wooden frame in the town square while people threw things at them, usually whatever cheap vegetables were available. And then there was the baker's dunking stool, which was essentially a splashy reminder to follow the rules. Nothing like being repeatedly dunked in cold water to encourage accuracy in bread measurements. Why such extreme measures over bread? Because a dishonest baker wasn't just annoying, they were threatening food security. Bread fraud was a serious matter. In medieval logic, it ranked somewhere between tax evasion and heresy. And speaking of heresy, that brings us to church rules. Now, don't worry, we're not diving into dark, dramatic territory here. But it's worth noting that the church loved rules. And not just spiritual ones, practical ones. For example, in some places, the church regulated when you were allowed to get married, when you were allowed to bathe, and when you were allowed to cut your hair. Sometimes this was about religious symbolism. Sometimes it was about controlling the population. And sometimes it was because someone, somewhere, tried to get married during Lent and caused a minor scandal. Rules were often reactions to specific incidents that spiraled into permanent policies. Very medieval. Another favorite rule, perhaps one of the most peculiar, was the medieval obsession with controlling where you were allowed to fish. Some rivers were strictly off-limits to commoners because they were reserved for nobility. Even if the river ran through your land. Even if you lived next to it your entire life. This wasn't about conservation, it was about power. Rivers were valuable resources, and nobles guarded them fiercely. Poaching a fish meant poaching a privilege, and that simply wouldn't do. But again, there was a practical side. Overfishing could destroy a local food source. And since medieval governments weren't exactly known for complicated environmental policies, the easiest solution was simply, only rich people can fish here. Problem solved. Well, for the rich people. Let's drift now to something a little more agricultural. In some medieval towns, you could be fined for allowing your pigs to roam unattended. Not because pigs were dangerous, though they certainly could be, Medieval pigs were basically small, angry tanks with hooves, but because they had a habit of getting into gardens, knocking over market stalls, and occasionally wandering into church services, where they were absolutely not welcome. Enough pig-related incidents happened in enough towns that many regions finally said, "That's it. Keep your pigs on a leash." It's strangely comforting to know that even in the Middle Ages, people struggled with their pets. And this brings us, slowly and gently, to the heart of why medieval rules seem so bizarre now. They were written by communities trying to maintain order in a messy, unpredictable world. A world without modern infrastructure. A world where fire, famine, and disease could destroy everything overnight. A world where people relied heavily on routine, tradition, and regulation to keep daily life steady. It's easy to laugh at a law like, no shoes longer than 6 inches, or don't wander around after dark without a lantern, or, do not, under any circumstances, consume gingerbread unless it is December and we say so. But for medieval people, these weren't quirky curiosities. They were the invisible threads holding society together, threads that could snap at any moment. Let's wander a little deeper into these rules and consider just how many were designed to prevent conflict. For example, some towns had regulations requiring neighbors to share certain tools or water sources peacefully.
Why?
Because if they didn't, those neighbors were likely to solve disputes in a much more medieval way. And if you've ever imagined two farmers arguing over a ladder until it escalates into a full-blown feud that lasts 6 generations, you're already ahead of the Middle Ages. There were rules about who could collect firewood, when you could harvest, how loudly you could argue in public, and whether your animals were allowed to graze near the road. There were rules about selling cheese, rules about brewing beer, rules about how wide your market stall could be, and even rules about how loudly you were allowed to ring a bell. Not a church bell, just your personal bell. The medieval version of noise complaints. Every rule had a story behind it, usually involving someone who made a spectacularly poor decision. And over the centuries, those rules stacked up, layer after layer, until a simple medieval village was governed by a surprising amount of regulation. Some serious, some strange, and some that now feel like the kind of thing a tired town official wrote at 2 a.m. out of pure frustration. And yet, these rules worked. They kept the peace. They guided behavior. They helped medieval communities function, however roughly. And they show us something quietly human. People in the past were constantly trying to make life a little less chaotic, a little more predictable, and a lot less dependent on whether your neighbor decided to let his goats run wild again. And as we drift toward the end of this first part, let's sit with one simple truth. These rules, strange as they are, tell us more about medieval daily life than battles, kings, or grand events ever could. They show us the tiny decisions, fears, annoyances, and priorities of ordinary people. People trying to survive, trying to maintain order, and sometimes just trying to prevent the local baker from scamming them. So now that we've wandered through a few of these wonderfully odd regulations, let me ask you something soft and simple, just before we drift onward. Which of these medieval rules do you think you would have struggled with the most, and why? Tell me in the comments.
Let's settle back in and drift gently from where we left off. We talked about those wonderfully odd medieval rules. The gingerbread restrictions, the 6-inch shoe laws, the nighttime lantern requirements. All those soft little glimpses into the everyday life of people long gone. Now we ease deeper into the Middle Ages, where the rules didn't just shape society. They often were society. Because in a world without proper police forces, reliable governments, streetlights, functioning sanitation, or neighbors who minded their own business, rules were the thin, creaky wooden beams keeping the roof over everyone's head. And unsurprisingly, many of these rules grew out of fear. Not fear in the dramatic sense, not dragons or invading armies or sorcerers whispering curses over cauldrons, but the much more boring, much more human fear of things going disastrously wrong in the middle of an otherwise normal Tuesday. So let's drift into one of the most strangely practical sets of rules in the medieval toolkit. Rules about cleanliness. Not hygiene. That would imply people were bathing regularly. But cleanliness in the sense of how not to contaminate the town's only water supply with something horrifying. You see, many medieval towns had one main well or fountain. Just one. And the last thing anyone wanted was for someone to pollute it with waste, spoiled meat, dead animals, laundry runoff, or, worst of all, tanning fluids. Medieval tanning involved things no one should ever describe right before bedtime, especially if you were hoping for pleasant dreams. So we'll keep it gentle and simply say that leather making required substances that were aromatically assertive. Tanners were forbidden from washing hides near drinking fountains, not because medieval people were delicate about smells. They most definitely were not. But because contaminated water was a straight path to illness. Nobody had figured out bacteria yet, but they had figured out that everybody gets sick when Geoffrey the Tanner washes his things upstream. Cause and effect. Medieval edition. These rules protected communities from invisible threats they didn't fully understand. They didn't need microscopes, they had patterns. If the pattern was don't let Geoffrey near the water, that became law. Simple. And then there were rules about where you could dump your trash. Medieval people produced less waste than we do, but what they had was, well, distinctive. Food scraps, broken pottery, animal bones, the occasional unfortunate fish head someone no longer wanted to look at. Some towns had designated dumping areas. Others required people to dispose of waste outside the city walls. Why outside the walls? Because nothing quite ruins a nice medieval stroll like stepping into your neighbor's week-old cabbage water. Also, trash attracts animals. And medieval animals were not cute. Rats the size of small cats. Dogs that had never heard the word domestic. Pigs that had ambitions. Rules about garbage existed because the alternative was plagues, pestilence, and pigs rampaging through the main square like they owned the place. Which, incidentally, brings us to another medieval rule. You could not simply let your animals roam wherever they pleased. This wasn't always enforced. Many towns looked like someone had spilled a barnyard across them. But places with stricter officials passed laws insisting that your goats, pigs, chickens, or sheep must be tied, fenced, watched, or at the very least not actively terrorizing the neighbors. Why? Because animals had a habit of eating gardens, knocking over market goods, wandering into church, interrupting court sessions, attacking drunken students, and occasionally leading children into swampy misadventures. The Middle Ages were basically one long pet ownership cautionary tale. Speaking of market goods, let's drift toward medieval market rules. These were some of the most detailed, nitpicky, and surprisingly strict laws of all. If you sold anything, meat, fish, eggs, bread, wool, spices, vegetables, ale, there were entire lists of what you could and could not do. You could not water down the wine. You could not water down the ale. You absolutely could not water down the milk, because milk was already suspicious enough without creative editing. You couldn't sell rotten produce unless you clearly labeled it as such, and even then it had to be sold at a lower price. Basically, medieval people invented the discount bin out of sheer necessity, long before supermarkets existed. The rules forced honesty in the market because dishonesty could cause sickness, shortages, or riots, and medieval towns loved a good riot. They were efficient, in the sense that nothing solved your problems quite like collectively flipping tables. Let's talk about fish rules because yes, they existed. Fresh fish spoiled fast, very fast, and medieval vendors had infinite creativity in selling fish that had been dead far too long. Some towns employed official fish tasters or fish inspectors. Imagine your job being sniffing questionable trout all day long. There were rules that if a fishmonger sold bad fish, the punishment could involve publicly dumping the offending seafood on their head. It was not a subtle era. Moving on from food, though medieval people rarely did, we come to another peculiar set of rules. Rules about public behavior. Modern life has regulations against littering, noise pollution, loitering, and public disturbance. Medieval life had rules like, do not scream insults at your neighbor from your window, or no swearing loudly in the street before church, or you may not hold a drunken wrestling match on the bridge during market hours, which was apparently such a recurring problem that multiple regions legislated against it. Why the concern? Because bridges were important. They were narrow, they were expensive, and two drunk men grappling on the bridge while shouting about borrowed tools was a guaranteed way to plunge someone into the river, followed by their tools, and possibly their dignity. So laws developed to prevent exactly this. Then there were laws against nighttime noise, especially in towns with curfews. Medieval walls amplified sound, so one overly enthusiastic lute player could effectively ruin the sleep of an entire neighborhood. Some towns banned playing instruments after dark, singing after dark, shouting after dark, or holding spontaneous street celebrations after dark. Medieval authorities may not have had electricity, but they absolutely had the spirit of modern quiet hours policies. Now let's drift into something a bit windier. Rules about chimneys and smoke. Not everyone had a chimney, but those who did had to follow rules about how high it must be, which direction it must face, and how often it must be cleaned. Why? Because medieval houses were fire hazards disguised as homes. A chimney that smoked too much could ignite a neighbor's roof. Or your own. And since fire brigades were mostly made of volunteers with buckets, prevention was the best defense. Some towns even had chimney inspectors, a job involving climbing onto roofs, judging angles, and deciding whether your chimney was sufficiently responsible. A little strange, perhaps, but in a town made of flammable everything, these rules made the difference between a quiet winter and a dramatic one. One of the most eccentric categories of rules involved marriage. Not the spiritual or emotional parts, the logistics. Who you could marry, when you could marry, and in some cases, how soon after childbirth or death you could marry. These rules sprang from a mix of religion, tradition, and the undeniable fact that people in the Middle Ages had a talent for creating complicated household dramas. For example, in some regions, you weren't allowed to marry during Lent. Not because the church disapproved of love, although they sometimes did, but because marriages meant feasts, and feasts meant meat, wine, music, dancing, and enthusiastic celebration. And Lent was specifically the time when you were not supposed to enjoy things. So the rule wasn't don't get married. It was don't cause a party during a season when the church is trying very hard to be serious. If you tried to get married anyway, the local priest might refuse. Or fine you, or simply glare at you intensely enough to discourage future enthusiasm. Then we come to bath rules, which existed mostly in cities that actually had public bathhouses. Contrary to the myth that medieval Europeans never bathed, many did. But bathhouses were regulated because they were social hubs, gossip centers, and occasionally not-so-secret spots for less wholesome activities. Rules tried to keep behavior modest, quiet, and morally upright. 3 things medieval bathhouses were not naturally inclined toward. Of course, eventually bathhouses fell out of favor due to disease scares, and by then many people claimed bathing was dangerous. Because nothing says medieval logic, quite like replacing a public health measure with a rumor. We should drift for a moment into rules about movement. Not physical movement, although some towns regulated dancing, but social movement. Medieval society was obsessed with hierarchy. Everything had a place. The king, the noble, the knight, the merchant, the peasant, the servant, the stray dog, and finally the unidentifiable creature under the stairs that everyone pretended not to see. Rules existed to maintain these boundaries. Servants couldn't wear noble clothing. Merchants couldn't ride horses that looked too fancy. Peasants couldn't use certain weapons. Commoners couldn't hunt certain animals. And in some places, sumptuary laws dictated which fabrics you could wear based on your income. Imagine living in a world where the government not only wants to know what you earn, it wants to approve your wardrobe. You save up for a velvet hat, stroll through town feeling fancy, and suddenly a city official taps you on the shoulder because your headgear is above your station. That was the medieval reality. Status was not a suggestion, it was a legal obligation. Now let's drift into something a little lighter, but still very medieval. Rules about festivals. Festivals were loud, joyful, chaotic, and occasionally hazardous. People drank, danced, fought, sang, accidentally set things on fire, intentionally set things on fire, and generally did everything except behave sensibly. So towns wrote rules about when festivals could happen, how long they could last, which streets could be blocked, and which taverns were required to close early to prevent festival-related overenthusiasm. It was not uncommon for a medieval celebration to end with the phrase, and that is why the town council passed a new law the very next morning. Let's drift now into something even more deeply human. Rules about property disputes. Medieval people argued about land constantly. Lines were vague, maps were inconsistent, and fences were optional. So rules developed. Where you could build, where you could plant, where your animals could graze, how close to a neighbor's wall you could stack firewood. Many rules came from court cases where one person complained that another person's cow had 2 hooves on their land, which was apparently a matter for legal escalation. The logic behind these rules wasn't foolish, it was practical. When people lived close together, without modern conveniences, friction was natural. Rules smoothed the edges. Not perfectly, but enough. And finally, before we drift toward the end of this part, let's talk about rules involving tools and work. In some towns, you could not run certain tools at night because the noise disturbed neighbors. You could not leave tools in the road. You could not block a street with your cart. You could not dig trenches without permission. You could not perform certain crafts without joining the appropriate guild. And you absolutely could not build anything without consulting someone who vaguely resembled an architect. even if the building in question was essentially a glorified wooden box. All these rules reveal the same quiet truth as before. Medieval people were trying to keep life stable in a world that was anything but. They used rules as a shield against chaos, against accidents, against each other, and sometimes against themselves. Sparkles, if you lived in a medieval town, which rule do you think you'd break by accident? And how quickly do you think it would happen? Tell me in the comments. Let's settle back into our slow drift, drifting onward from the bustling, muddy, rule-filled streets of Part 2 into something a little quieter, a little stranger, and quite a bit more human. Because as much as medieval life was shaped by regulations about bread weights, fish inspections, curfews, lanterns, livestock, and the occasional forbidden velvet hat, there were whole categories of rules that reveal the softer, subtler anxieties of the Middle Ages. Rules that weren't just about economics or fire safety, but about behavior, reputation, superstition, and the endless medieval concern that someone somewhere might be enjoying themselves a little too boldly. So let's drift deeper. One thing medieval people were exceptionally concerned about was public reputation. Not just for nobles who lived and breathed social hierarchy, but for ordinary townspeople too. Reputation wasn't a vague thing, it was currency. It determined business, marriage prospects, friendships, alliances, and sometimes whether the local officials would treat you with suspicion or sympathy. And so, naturally, medieval towns developed rules about what you were and were not allowed to say about other people. In some regions, you could be fined for spreading false rumors. In other regions, you could be punished for gossiping too loudly. Not for the gossip itself. Medieval people adored gossip the way modern people adore scrolling social media, but for causing disturbances. And yes, there were genuinely written rules that amounted to please keep the drama at a conversational volume. Slander laws were surprisingly detailed. If you accused someone of being a thief, or a liar, or a witch, or simply untrustworthy near goats, you could be dragged before a local court and asked to prove it. And since proving things was not exactly a medieval skill set, this was an era where evidence might consist of Gertrude said so. These cases got messy fast. Of course, that didn't stop people from trying. Accusations flew through medieval villages like birds during springtime, constant, noisy, and occasionally pooping on the wrong person's reputation. But the existence of slander rules shows that at least someone was trying to curb the chaos. Or at least pretend to. Speaking of chaos, another fascinating category of rules involved hospitality, which medieval society viewed as something between a virtue, a duty, and an occasional burden. Many regions had rules requiring townspeople to host travelers, especially during busy seasons or during emergencies. If a stranger arrived in town after dark, the community sometimes had an obligation to shelter them. This wasn't about kindness, though some people were kind, but about safety. A lone traveler outside the walls at night was vulnerable not just to thieves and wolves, but to accusation. If something happened to them, the town might be blamed for neglect. These hospitality rules could get oddly specific. Some villages had designated guest houses, but others simply rotated travelers among residents. Imagine a medieval official knocking on your door at night with a tired merchant behind him, saying, "It's your turn." You would be expected to offer a place to sleep, often the floor, and some food, even if the food was something delightfully grim like cold porridge or hard bread that doubled as structural material. Stranger still were the rules about weddings and feasts, which communities tried to regulate not because they disliked joy, but because joy had a habit of spilling into the streets in ways that caused property damage. People danced, sang, argued, drank, fell asleep in inconvenient places, and occasionally wrestled on bridges, which we've already established was discouraged. Some towns limited how many guests you could invite. Others restricted how long the music could continue. A few even regulated how much food the hosts were allowed to provide, because extravagant feasts encouraged social competition, and social competition encouraged social chaos, and social chaos encouraged the local officials to write new rules out of sheer frustration. Then there were rules about courtship, and oh, these reveal so much about medieval anxieties. In some towns, men weren't allowed to serenade women under their windows after a certain hour. Not because it was romantic, but because it was loud. Even worse, serenades often turned into group activities, drunken group activities, with lutes, flutes, and very questionable singing. So rules were written, not against courtship, but against noisy courtship. Medieval romance was fine, as long as it wasn't audible past the second house. Other places had rules against giving certain gifts as tokens of affection. Not because gifts were forbidden, but because some gifts implied commitments that families didn't want to deal with. A pair of gloves? Acceptable. A ring? Serious. A belt buckle? For some reason, scandalous in certain regions. No one entirely knows why. Medieval symbolism remains charmingly baffling. Meanwhile, rules about public fighting grew increasingly elaborate over the centuries. Medieval people had a natural talent for turning disagreements into physical contests, especially during markets or festivals, or basically any gathering involving more than 3 people. So rules were written restricting where you could fight, when you could fight, and what constituted a legal fight versus. You punched your neighbor because he insulted your turnips. In some regions, official combat could be legally scheduled, not quite duels, but more like controlled disagreements. But spontaneous fights in public squares were often fined, not because authorities cared who won, but because the spectators blocked roads, knocked over stalls, and sometimes escalated into full-blooded community drama. Another fascinating rule category concerned noise management, which medieval towns cared about far more than you might expect from societies filled with livestock, tradesmen, and people shouting about bread prices. Being noisy during certain hours could get you fined. Ringing bells unnecessarily could get you scolded. Playing instruments after dark? Restricted. Hosting loud card games after midnight? Also restricted. Though, to be fair, medieval card games tended to be less quiet entertainment and more competitive yelling. Some towns even regulated church bell ringing, because enthusiastic bell ringers sometimes treated them like medieval DJ equipment. Less ringing, the town council would say, unless something is truly on fire. This was often accompanied by a footnote clarifying that metaphorical fires did not count. And then there were the rules about animals in public places, which pick up where Part 2 left off and take things to even more scenic absurdity. For example, some medieval towns banned keeping geese inside city walls because goose droppings caused slippery streets, and slippery streets caused accidents, and accidents caused complaints, and complaints caused someone in authority to sigh heavily and write a law that no one really wanted to enforce. Dogs had rules too. Large dogs often had to be chained in public. Barking at night could lead to fines. Allowing your dog to enter church was forbidden almost everywhere. Not for theological reasons, but because dogs had a delightful habit of sprinting up the aisle chasing cats, causing chaos in the middle of sermons. And yet, despite these rules, medieval Europe was filled with wandering animals. Cats followed fishermen. Dogs followed bakers. Chickens followed absolutely no one, because chickens have never respected authority. Another deeply human category of medieval rules dealt with resources. Firewood, for example, was precious. Entire forests were regulated. You couldn't always chop wood freely. Certain regions required permits, others required fees. Others limited the number of bundles you could collect per day. Why? Because without rules, forests disappeared. And without forests, winter became much colder and much shorter in the lifelong capacity sense. Water rights were even more strictly controlled. The right to draw water from certain streams belonged to specific households. The right to use certain mills belonged to certain landowners. And rules enforced these rights with impressive seriousness. Using someone else's mill was not a minor offense. It could be treated as theft, because mills were sources of profit. They were medieval engines of commerce, and those who owned them guarded their rights ferociously. Even more curious were rules about architecture. Rules dictating how close houses could be, how tall buildings could grow, how much a roof could overhang into the street. Because medieval streets were narrow and winding, even small architectural decisions could cause real problems. A roof that jutted out too far could block rainwater runoff, which might sound minor until you remember that medieval drainage systems were essentially let gravity figure it out. Some areas required homes to have a gutter or a spout that directed rainwater into the street at a specific angle. Others banned building too close to communal wells, too close to walls, too close to churches. These rules weren't about aesthetics. They were about keeping the town functional, safe, and not perpetually damp. Now, drifting forward, we reach something wonderfully mundane: rules about tools. Yes, medieval towns regulated tools. You couldn't leave ladders lying in public pathways. You couldn't store barrels in alleys where carts needed to pass. You couldn't leave grinding stones in the street because someone might trip over them in the dark. And you definitely couldn't borrow tools without asking, though that one may have been more strongly worded custom than actual law. Some guilds even had rules about how tools must be maintained. A blacksmith's hammer had to meet certain standards. A carpenter's saw had to be the right shape. A baker's peel, the long wooden paddle used for bread, had specific length requirements. These rules protected quality, consistency, and, to some degree, professional pride. No one wanted to be known as the town craftsman with inferior tools, because that reputation stuck harder than dried mud. And yet, despite all these rules, the slander laws, hospitality obligations, noise restrictions, fish inspections, doorway measurements, bell regulations, architectural codes, and guild tool standards, medieval society still managed to be delightfully chaotic. Rules weren't designed to eliminate disorder. They were designed to soften it, to guide it, to nudge society in a direction that was at least minimally manageable. But the chaos remained. Medieval people argued, feasted, fought, gossiped, ignored curfews, broke clothing rules, let their animals wander, and occasionally threw fish at each other in protest of fish-related fines. The rules shaped life, but life shaped the rules right back. And before we drift toward let me leave you with a soft, sleepy question. Sparkles, if you lived in a medieval town, which rule do you think you'd end up enforcing? And why? Tell me in the comments. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, welcome back. And if you're half asleep, that's perfectly fine too. Tonight, we're just gliding deeper through the dim corridors of medieval life, where rules were strange, logic was flexible, and everyone operated under a set of assumptions that would make modern people blink twice. Once in confusion, and once in mild concern. We ended last time wandering through the world of medieval hospitality, where guests overstayed, hosts couldn't refuse them, and everybody desperately tried to pretend that this system was efficient. Now we drift gently into a different area of medieval existence. The rules that governed food, festivals, and bodily behavior. Because of course they had rules for everything. And of course those rules were often bizarre, contradictory, and enforced by people who were themselves barely following them. Let's settle in, dim the lights, and keep drifting. One of the quieter oddities of the medieval world was their obsession with regulating what people could eat depending on the day of the week, the season, and sometimes how badly the clergy wanted to guilt someone. Fasting wasn't merely a spiritual practice. It was practically a scheduling system. Wednesdays and Fridays were typically fasting days, and Lent was essentially one long reminder that medieval life wasn't supposed to be enjoyable. Fish became the default food, because naturally the church had declared fish acceptable, while meat was not. Why fish got a free pass is the kind of question scholars still debate, though the general consensus is that fish lived in water, and somehow that made them less decadent. Medieval logic was wonderfully imaginative. This led to entire culinary traditions focused on tricking people into believing food was what it wasn't. Cooks created imitation meat dishes like faux bacon made of fish molded into goose shapes, or, my personal favorite, a medieval creation called mock venison made out of minced herring dyed aggressively red. Imagine biting into something that looks like a roasted leg of deer, only for your mouth to be ambushed by the unmistakable flavor of seaside disappointment. Medieval cooks took pride in this kind of culinary illusionism, which tells you all you need to know about how bored people were and how severely the church's rules shaped daily life. But perhaps the best part of these food rules was that rich people often just circumvented them in creative, utterly shameless ways. There are records of kings who declared certain animals to be fish, so they could eat them during fasts. Beavers, for instance, with their flat tails and semi-aquatic lifestyle, were officially granted honorary fish status. This meant their tails could be consumed without guilt, even if the rest of the animal technically remained outside the church's fish category. And yes, this led to some awkward dinners where nobles pretended they were following the rules while tearing into beaver tail like it was a divine loophole. The strangest example, though, might be the occasional ruling that certain birds, such as puffins, could be counted as fish since they lived on the sea. Medieval Europe survived through technicalities, a true human tradition. And while we laugh at the idea of a puffin being treated as a fish, remember that for the medieval mind, the reasoning made sense. It lived near the ocean, it tasted vaguely fishy, and they really wanted something other than dried cod. Let's drift on from the dinner table to something equally important. Medieval festivals. Events that were equal parts religious obligation, chaotic public gathering, and community-wide attempt to forget how tedious life could be. Medieval people worked hard, but they celebrated even harder, sometimes to the point of uncomfortable civic collapse. One of the more fascinating medieval celebrations was the Feast of Fools, a festival where the roles of society were deliberately flipped upside down. The lowest-ranking clergy members would pretend to be bishops, ordinary citizens might mock authority figures openly, and everyone took part in a kind of structured, communal misbehavior that was tolerated only once a year. It was a rare moment when laughter, disorder, and mild chaos were not only allowed but encouraged. The Feast of Fools existed because medieval society was intensely hierarchical and deeply repressed. So, naturally, it needed pressure valves. Without them, someone might accidentally start a rebellion, which, to be fair, did happen occasionally anyway. The Feast of Fools let everyone pretend that social order was flexible, even though, the next morning, it snapped back into place with near mathematical certainty. The most amusing part is that church officials often complained loudly about how inappropriate and scandalous the festival was. But they didn't eliminate it for centuries. And why? Because they knew suppressing it entirely would cause more problems than it solved. Better to let people enjoy their one day of sanctioned nonsense before returning to obedience. It was, in a way, the medieval equivalent of letting children run around screaming for 10 minutes so they'll be quiet later. But if festivals offered chaotic freedom, the behavior expected during the rest of the year was much more rigid. Medieval people had rules for posture, appearance, and even how one should sneeze in public. Yes, sneezing etiquette was a thing. In some regions, sneezing too loudly or too dramatically was considered rude, possibly because it startled livestock or suggested you had an excess of bodily vapors, which was always judged suspiciously. The polite thing was to stifle your sneeze modestly, and then thank God quietly for not letting your soul escape through your nose, which, believe it or not, was a legitimate fear in some earlier periods. And we haven't even approached the labyrinth of sumptuary laws, rules designed to control what people could wear, because society needed to make sure everyone stayed visually in their assigned hierarchy. Commoners were often banned from wearing certain fabrics, colors, or decorations, even if they could afford them. The color purple was restricted in many regions, reserved for royalty or high nobility. Fur trims, especially ermine, were similarly restricted. The logic behind this was simple. If commoners started dressing like nobles, nobles would lose the ability to visually intimidate people from across the marketplace. And naturally, the nobles were not about to risk that. There were even rules about how many buttons you could have on a garment. Buttons were expensive, painstaking to make, and seen as tiny luxury items. Having more buttons than your social rank allowed was considered borderline fraudulent. Imagine an official coming up to someone at a fair and counting their buttons to make sure they weren't exceeding their status. It happened. It absolutely happened. It was the medieval equivalent of checking someone's tax records based on the shine of their shoes. The irony is that enforcement was inconsistent at best. Wealthy merchants loved testing the boundaries, and nobles loved complaining about how merchants were dressing above their station. One medieval writer lamented that he could no longer tell who was noble just by looking, which, for him, must have been devastating. Imagine wandering a marketplace not knowing whose boots you were supposed to admire. Now, let's drift gently toward one of the more quietly entertaining medieval rules: the strange, unspoken regulations around public bathing. Medieval Europe was more hygienic than popular myths claim. Though, to be fair, that wasn't a very high bar. Public bathhouses were common, especially in the earlier Middle Ages, and people used them regularly for relaxation, socialization, and occasionally, activities the church disapproved of. Naturally, because bathhouses were popular and morally questionable, they needed rules. Some towns required bathhouses to ring bells or send someone through the streets to announce when the water was fresh, because bathhouses were expensive to run, and not every guest wanted to bathe in what was essentially a large communal soup. Others forbade mixed-gender bathing, though this rule was frequently ignored. In some places, women were allowed in during specific hours, men during others, and couples might have special evenings. There were also rules about what food or drink could be brought into the bathhouse. Eating in the bath was considered impolite, but people did it anyway. Wine was especially popular, which made bathhouses a combination of spa, bar, and unregulated social experiment. The church eventually shut many of them down, citing moral concerns and potential disease transmission. But the timing was interesting. Bathhouses declined significantly during epidemics, not because they spread disease, but because people associated them with danger. Fear replaced habit. Hygiene became inconsistent, and Europe slowly drifted away from public bathing as a norm. But during the height of bathhouse culture, the rules around them shaped much of social life. Rules also governed how people interacted with animals, because medieval society depended heavily on livestock and working animals. In some regions, it was illegal to beat a plow horse excessively, not because of compassion, but because a dead horse meant less food for everyone. In other places, pigs were allowed to roam freely, which led to the occasional problem of pigs attacking unattended children. An issue serious enough that several towns had to create laws banning pigs from wandering the streets. There were even pig trials, where pigs were brought before courts and judged for crimes. Yes, medieval legal systems held actual trials for animals. And yes, animals sometimes had defense lawyers. It was equal parts tragic, bizarre, and strangely bureaucratic. Following these rules could be exhausting, but breaking them could be expensive or dangerous. For example, there were rules about when you could grind grain, because mills were often controlled by local lords, and grinding grain without paying the fee was considered a serious offense. Some peasants built secret handmills to avoid taxes, leading to a surprisingly intense game of cat and mouse between lords and villagers. The lords' officials would search homes, confiscate illegal mills, and fine the offenders. That's right. Medieval contraband wasn't just exotic spices or foreign silks. Sometimes it was just a small, homemade grinding stone. Now let's drift towards something quieter but equally strange: the rules of medieval silence. Monasteries, especially, enforced long stretches where speaking was forbidden, creating a serene but somewhat eerie atmosphere. Communication shifted into gestures, sign language, or subtle looks. Some monasteries developed elaborate gesture systems so monks could ask for bread, tools, or even books without speaking. Silence was seen as spiritually purifying, but monks were human, and naturally, they found ways around the rules. Whispering behind pillars, writing short notes, or accidentally speaking while praying were common. The rule of silence was never perfect, yet it defined monastic life for centuries. And as we drift farther, we can't ignore the peculiar rules surrounding medieval justice. Rules that relied less on evidence and more on symbolism, physical endurance, or divine intervention. Trial by ordeal was one such system. Whether you were plunged into boiling water, forced to carry hot iron, or thrown into a river to see if you floated, the idea was that God would protect the innocent. The logic was circular and comforting in its own way. If you were innocent, God would save you. If you weren't saved, well, that was your answer. Convenient, effective, deeply terrifying. The transition away from ordeal-based justice didn't happen until the Church officially banned it in the early 13th century. After that, courts slowly moved toward witness testimony and written evidence. But for many generations, ordeals were the norm, and people accepted them because they aligned with the worldview that divine power was actively involved in daily life. As we drift to the end of this part, think about how all these rules for food, festivals, clothing, bathing, animals, silence, justice shaped every hour of medieval life. People lived inside a web of expectations that made sense in their world, but seem eccentric in ours. And yet, beneath the strangeness, the logic is always there, quiet but unwavering. Rules existed because they solved problems, or at least tried to. Even when those solutions involved declaring a puffin to be a fish or holding a courtroom session for a pig. Before we fully drift out of here's a gentle question to ponder, or answer if you're still awake. If you had to live under one weird medieval rule for a full year, which one would you choose, and why? Feel free to tell me in the comments when you wake up. Welcome back, or welcome forward, or welcome sideways, depending on how your night is going. If you're still awake after part 4, that's impressive. If you drifted off in the middle of the puffin being a fish section and only now resurfaced mid-sentence, that's also perfectly valid. Tonight we're gliding into the next set of medieval rules. The odd ones, the oddly practical ones, and the ones that make you sit back and wonder whether anyone in the Middle Ages was getting enough sleep. Considering the living conditions, probably not. Last time, we floated through food regulations, bathhouse rules, festival chaos, clothing laws, and even the surprisingly bureaucratic world of pig trials. Now we'll drift onward into a realm just as strange: the rules that governed land, work, family life, and the human body. Medieval society was built on an intricate foundation of customs and expectations, many of which operated with the kind of internal logic that only makes sense if you've never seen the outside world. Let's settle in again, breathe slowly, maybe adjust your blanket, and drift deeper. One of the most peculiar yet foundational medieval rules was the idea that land wasn't really owned by the person living on it. Instead, almost everything technically belonged to someone higher up the hierarchy, and often someone who hadn't visited the property in decades, if ever. This led to a system where peasants farmed land, paid taxes on it, owed services on it, and passed it down to their children, but still didn't fully own it. Their relationship to land was closer to a permanent rental agreement with obligations so complicated that even modern lawyers would politely decline involvement. And because medieval society loved rules, there were restrictions on how peasants could use the land. You couldn't cut down certain trees because those trees technically belonged to the lord. You couldn't hunt most animals because wildlife was considered noble property, especially deer. Killing a deer without permission was practically treated as an invitation to public punishment. In some cases, it could even lead to execution. Imagine risking your life because you got too close to a forest while hungry. The irony, of course, is that deer often wandered into village fields, ate the crops, and then trotted away smugly because the villagers weren't allowed to touch them. Medieval life had its little injustices. And by little, I mean constant. But people adapted, as they always do, creating their own unwritten rules to survive the system. Villagers might collectively scare deer away, repair fences together, or build makeshift traps that technically didn't kill the animals, but gently persuaded them to leave. Medieval society was nothing if not creative in its problem-solving, especially when breaking a rule meant legal disaster. Another unusual regulation revolved around milling grain, a topic far more dramatic than it sounds. Millers were often viewed with suspicion, partially because they controlled the grinding of grain and partially because they had a reputation for creative accounting. The rule in many parts of Europe required villagers to use the lord's mill rather than their own hand mills, which were taxed, banned, or confiscated if found. Hand mills were small, portable, and easy to hide, and so a secret economy of illegal milling emerged. There are records of officials sneaking into peasant homes, searching for hidden stones tucked under beds or disguised as household items. Imagine having to smuggle your kitchen equipment like it's contraband. And if you were caught, you might be fined or have the millstone broken in public as a warning to others. The idea that someone's forbidden grinder could become a symbol of resistance feels almost poetic. These milling regulations weren't just about money. They were about control. Grinding grain meant independence. And independence, in the medieval worldview, was dangerous. Better to keep everyone linked to a central system, even if that system was run by a miller with the moral compass of a slightly dishonest raccoon. Let's drift from rural fields into the household, where rules took on a different shape. Smaller, more intimate, but equally revealing. Medieval marriages, for instance, had their own complicated web of expectations. The church was deeply involved in regulating marriage, even determining who could marry whom. Cousin marriages were discouraged, though, ironically, ignored by royal families who treated cousins as the medieval equivalent of a dating pool. But for commoners, rules could be surprisingly strict. One particularly interesting rule required public declarations of marriage in the presence of witnesses. A marriage technically could be formed simply by mutual consent, but because secret marriages caused problems, especially inheritance disputes, communities insisted on formal announcements. These announcements served not only as legal validation, but also as a way to let anyone object if something seemed inappropriate. For example, if a groom happened to be accidentally married already, which did happen, or if someone in the crowd knew the bride and groom were related more closely than permitted. The idea was to keep marriages transparent, though that doesn't mean they were simple. Dowry negotiations, land transfers, and household duties were all tightly regulated, not by law alone, but also by local custom. A family might insist on very specific obligations, how chores were divided, when goods were exchanged, or even what type of work a spouse was expected to contribute to communal life. Marriage was not just a romantic alliance. It was a mini-contract for survival. And sometimes, these rules extended into the bedroom in ways that modern readers might find unbelievably intrusive. The church dictated when couples could and couldn't be intimate. Certain days of the week, certain holy seasons, and certain festivals were off-limits. There were even charts listing approved and forbidden days. If you wanted to find a comprehensive map of medieval intimacy, you simply had to ask your priest, which is not a sentence anyone should ever have to say. Let's drift onward to the rules surrounding children, the quiet, daily expectations that shaped medieval childhood. Children were often treated as little adults, expected to work as soon as they could walk steadily without running directly into livestock. Rules dictated which tasks they could perform, which tools they could handle, and which spaces they could enter. Many towns restricted children from mills, blacksmith shops, and certain craft workshops unless apprenticed, partially for safety, partially to prevent mischievous behavior, which was legendary. Childhood wasn't unregulated freedom. It was structured, supervised, and woven into the fabric of work life. Even toys were sometimes controlled. In some areas, children were forbidden from playing games in the streets during market days because merchants didn't want to trip over wooden hoops or flying pebbles. One town in England even banned ball games near the church after several windows were broken by enthusiastic youths. You can almost picture the stern town official shaking a finger at a group of boys holding a leather ball, explaining why their fun was now a legally recognized inconvenience. Speaking of strict towns, medieval urban life had its own labyrinth of rules. Cities were bustling but fragile ecosystems where fire, disease, and chaos were always lurking. So naturally, towns created regulations for everything from where you could dump waste to what time your pig was allowed to walk freely through the streets. And yes, pigs often had curfews. Many towns required pigs to be ringed, meaning a small metal ring in their snouts, to prevent them from rooting around in garbage heaps. A pig without a ring was considered a public menace, which feels oddly specific, but also strangely fair. Fire regulations were even stricter. Some towns required residents to extinguish all household flames at dusk except for one small, covered hearth. This wasn't just a safety measure, it was a survival strategy. A single spark could burn an entire city to the ground. Firefighters existed in some areas, but they were usually volunteers with buckets, shouting instructions that no one followed. Noise regulations also existed, which might surprise people who imagine medieval towns as lively, chaotic places. Some towns banned nighttime singing or loud instruments. Others prohibited blacksmiths from hammering after dark. A few required taverns to close at specific hours, though taverns rarely obeyed. If there is one universal truth in human history, it is that taverns do not respect closing times. Let's drift gently now toward rules that govern the human body. Specifically, how the body should behave in public. Medieval etiquette manuals were surprisingly strict. There were rules about how to sit, how to hold your hands, how to chew, and how to avoid being an unpleasant dinner companion. Chewing with your mouth open was frowned upon, of course, but so was using both hands to tear bread. One hand was considered more civilized. Drinking directly from a shared pitcher was a crime against decency. Sneezing loudly, as mentioned earlier, was nearly a moral offense. And then there were the rules for spitting, which medieval Europe took very seriously. Spitting was common, practically unavoidable, but where and how you spat was fiercely regulated. Spitting on the table was forbidden. Spitting on the floor was discouraged but tolerated. Spitting across the room was an immediate social failure. The polite way was to spit discreetly into a cloth or into the fireplace, assuming you were willing to stand up and walk across the room. Considering how cold medieval homes were, this was a heroic effort. Now let's drift into one of the more unexpectedly tender areas of medieval rules: hospitality customs within the home. In many places, it was considered deeply rude to refuse a traveler shelter, even if you barely had enough room. Guests were treated with exaggerated courtesy, given the best food available, and offered a place by the fire. This wasn't just kindness, though that played a part. Hospitality was a social currency. You helped travelers because one day you or your children might be travelers, relying on strangers for safety. Rules dictated everything: how much food a guest should receive, whether they should be offered wine, where they should sleep, and how long they were expected to stay. Some guests politely departed after a night or two. Others lingered far beyond what the host considered reasonable. And because hospitality was sacred, the host couldn't eject them without risking their reputation. The line between generosity and captivity blurred constantly. Finally, we drift into the quiet, peculiar rules surrounding travel. Because medieval roads were unpredictable, dangerous, and often controlled by local authorities or toll collectors. Travelers were expected to carry documents proving who they were and why they were traveling. Certain roads were forbidden after dark. Bridges required tolls. River crossings had strict hours. If you tried to travel outside the approved routes, you might be stopped, questioned, or fined. These travel rules weren't always enforced, but their presence shaped how people moved, where they went, and how they interacted with others. Movement was a privilege, not a right. and navigating the landscape required not only physical endurance, but a constant awareness of local regulations, many of which varied from village to village. As we near the end of Part 5, think about how all these rules, from land to milling, marriage to childhood, pigs to posture, wove together into a world where every action had a structure, a purpose, or at least a tradition behind it. Medieval life was constantly negotiated, endlessly regulated, and yet profoundly human. Before we drift into Part 6, here's a soft question to ponder. If you had to follow one medieval household rule, maybe hospitality, etiquette, or clothing, which one do you think you'd handle the best? Tell me in the comments when you wake up. Night settled over the restored cloister like a soft velvet shroud, the kind that dampens footsteps, swallows whispers, and convinces even the most restless mind that perhaps, just perhaps, it could finally be still for a moment. The lamps Aldrich had ordered placed along the gallery flickered in calm, obedient globes of gold, their light reflected on the polished stone floor like tiny, glowing islands. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, no alarms sounded. No shouts. No frantic messengers sprinting down the halls. Just peace. A tender, fragile peace. Ira stood alone in the old herbarium, running her fingers along the spines of weathered books arranged on newly repaired shelves. Many had survived the collapse by pure luck, others because Aldrich, in a moment of wild instinct, had shielded them with his own body as the ceiling came down. She'd scolded him then, of course. She'd scolded him many times since. But in the same breath, she'd also helped him bandage the gash across his shoulder, muttering something that sounded suspiciously like affection. A quiet cough came from the doorway. She turned to find Thane leaning against the frame, arms crossed, looking strangely, like a soldier who didn't know what to do with silence. "You're up late," he said. Ira raised an eyebrow. "You're one to talk." "Yes, well." He glanced over his shoulder as if checking for an audience. "The calm is unsettling." "It's just calm," she said gently. "Not a threat." "I didn't say it was a threat." "You implied it." He scowled. "I don't imply things." "You don't intend to," she corrected, smiling. Thane exhaled through his nose, which was as close to a laugh as he typically allowed. But then his expression shifted, taking on that rare, thoughtful seriousness he kept locked away behind layers of soldierly discipline. "How long do you think this will last?" he asked. Ira closed the book she'd been holding, brushing dust off its cover. "Peace." "Yes." She took a slow breath. Candles flickered softly along the walls. The night hummed with the faintest breeze carrying the scent of mountain pine and cold stone. "Longer than before," she finally answered. "But not forever." Thane nodded. He'd expected that. "Nothing lasts forever," he murmured. "Hope can," she countered. He lifted his eyes to hers, sharp, shaken, but steadied by something he couldn't voice. Before he could reply, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Purposeful, heavy, bearing the unmistakable rhythm of a man preparing himself to say something difficult. Aldrich appeared in the doorway. "Ah," Thane muttered. "Of course." Aldrich stopped short when he saw them. "Interrupting?" "Always," Thane replied, pushing off the doorway. "It's practically your hobby." Aldrich ignored him and turned to Ira instead, though there was a faint twitch in the corner of his mouth that suggested he'd enjoyed the jab. "May I speak with you?" Ira nodded. "Of course." Thane gave her a long, knowing look. One of those "I will absolutely interrogate you about this later" looks. Before he slipped out, leaving Aldrich standing amidst the soft glow of candlelight and the smell of crushed lavender. Aldrich cleared his throat. "I've been thinking." "Dangerous," she teased. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I deserve that." Ira set the book aside and leaned against the table. "Go on." "I've sent word to the mountain clans," he said. "About the breach beneath the citadel. About the creature we saw in the chasm." Ira's breath caught. "You're certain?" Aldrich nodded slowly. "Its movement, its howl, it wasn't stone shifting. It wasn't a natural formation collapsing." His jaw tightened. "Someone or something is waking it." The room felt suddenly smaller. Colder. "Did the clans respond?" Ira asked. "A messenger arrived this evening," Aldrich said. "But the news isn't what I hoped for." She waited. "The clans say they've felt tremors for weeks," he continued. "But they believe the cause is not from below." He held her gaze. "They think something above the surface is disturbing the balance." Ira's eyes widened. "Above? As in?" "As in someone is seeking whatever lies beneath the citadel," Aldrich finished grimly. "Actively." And they're close. Ira moved toward him, heart pounding in her throat. Who would do that? Aldrich hesitated. That was answer enough. You already know, she whispered. I have a suspicion, he admitted. One I wish weren't true. The candles flickered violently, as if stirred by an unseen breath. Ira swallowed. Tell me. But before Aldrich could answer, a young page skidded into the room, panting, cheeks flushed red from running. Commander. The scouts. They've spotted movement on the North Ridge. Aldrich stiffened. How many? Just one, sir. A lone figure. Watching the citadel. Ira's blood ran cold. Not approaching? No, my lady, the boy said, shaking his head. Just watching. Like he's waiting. Aldrich reached for his sword almost reflexively. I'll handle it. No, Ira said sharply, grabbing his wrist. Not alone. His eyes softened. Ira, you just said something is awakening beneath us, she cut in. And someone above us is searching for it. You're not going alone. Aldrich hesitated. For once, he didn't argue. Thane arrived not a minute later, already fully armed, giving Aldrich a look of resigned irritation. Of course you're going out again. And of course I'm coming with you. To the ridge, Aldrich said. We don't know who or what is up there. Thane cracked his knuckles. All the more reason. The three of them left the herbarium and stepped into the frozen night. The wind howled along the cliffs, scattering fine snowflakes like shimmering dust. The moon hung low and swollen, bathing the mountain in a cold, pale glow that made every shadow feel alive. They climbed the ridge slowly, cautiously, listening for breaking twigs, shifting gravel, or anything that suggested movement. Nothing. Only silence. But the air felt wrong. Too dense, too heavy, like the moments before a storm. When they reached the crest, Thane raised a fist, signaling them to stop. There, he whispered. A lone figure stood at the far edge of the ridge, silhouetted against the moon. Long cloak, hood drawn, motionless, watching the citadel. Identify yourself, Aldrich called out. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even turn. Ira felt a prickle crawl down her arms. The wind died suddenly, completely, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Aldrich took a step forward. I won't ask again. Who are you? The figure finally moved, but only enough to turn his head, just slightly, just enough that the moonlight caught the edge of a pale, human face. A voice drifted across the cliff. Low, calm. I wondered how long it would take before you returned, Aldrich. Aldrich froze. Ira's heart hammered. Thane's hand went straight to his sword. You, Aldrich breathed. That's impossible. The man, if he was truly a man, lowered his hood. His face was familiar. Too familiar. Aldrich staggered backward as if struck. By the gods, Thane rasped. He looks exactly like. Aldrich, Ira whispered. He looks like you. The stranger smiled, a thin, knowing, unsettling smile. Not like him, the man corrected softly, stepping closer. I am him. The wind rushed back in a violent gust, whipping snow into spirals. The ridge trembled, and the stranger, Aldrich's impossible reflection, vanished into the storm. Thane cursed and sprinted forward, but the spot where the man had stood was empty. No footprints. No trace. Ira grabbed Aldrich's arm. What does this mean? Aldrich didn't answer at first. His eyes remained fixed on the empty ridge. Haunted. Hollow. I thought he was dead, Aldrich whispered. But if he's alive, if he's the one stirring what sleeps beneath the mountain, then everything we've done. He swallowed hard. Might already be too late. They descended the ridge slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them like fresh snowfall. The citadel lights glowed warmly in the distance, unaware of the storm rolling toward them. Ira walked close beside Aldrich. Do you trust yourself to tell us the truth? He hesitated, then nodded barely. Yes, but you won't like it. Thane snorted. We never like it. Just tell us anyway. Aldrich didn't smile, didn't speak. Not until they'd returned to the citadel, passed through the reinforced gates, and stepped into the war room where maps lay scattered across the long table. Only then did he finally speak. My brother, Aldrich said quietly. The one we buried 15 years ago was never truly buried. The room went silent. Even the torches seemed to lean in, listening. He wanted power, Aldrich continued. Not the power of titles or thrones. Something older. Something beneath this mountain. He braced his hands against the table. Something I hoped we'd never see again. Ira's voice trembled. If he's awakened it. Aldrich shook his head. No, not awakened. Summoned. Thane swore under his breath. What does he want? Ira asked. Aldrich lifted his gaze. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years trying to outrun a shadow shaped exactly like himself. He wants the mountain to collapse, Aldrich said. He wants the world to forget this citadel ever stood. And he wants me to watch it burn. The candles guttered. The stone beneath their feet shivered. Far below, deep in the hidden caverns under the citadel, something enormous shifted in the dark, its rumble rolling upward like the growl of a waking beast. And for the first time since the chasm opened, Ira felt fear. Real fear. Aldrich closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself. Then he looked at them both. We prepare at dawn, he said. Whatever is coming, it won't wait. If you were standing on that frozen ridge and saw a mysterious figure with your exact face watching you, would you approach them or run? Tell me honestly, what do you think Aldrich's brother truly wants? Dawn came reluctantly to the citadel, dragging a pale, washed-out light across the courtyard stones as if unsure whether the night truly deserved to end. The mountains remained half-swallowed in a cold, bluish mist, and the air held that strange, suspended stillness that occurs when the world is bracing itself, quiet but not peaceful, like the hush before a verdict. Inside the war room, Aldrich stood at the head of the long table, staring at the faded map of the northern ridge. Ira had been there only minutes before. Her teacup still steamed faintly beside a heap of old scrolls. Thane was sharpening his blade near the far wall, sending rhythmic steel-on-stone whispers drifting through the room like a metronome marking time before disaster. Aldrich had barely slept. Ira had attempted to make him. Thane had attempted to order him. Neither succeeded. Some burdens didn't loosen their grip in a single night. He traced the outline of the mountain on the map. Below that inked shape were caverns, old, forgotten, rumored about caverns whose entrances were sealed centuries ago to keep something trapped. Or preserved. The stories never agreed. But Aldrich knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever he saw on the ridge last night was not an illusion. And whatever stirred beneath the mountain was not finished waking. He straightened slowly as footsteps approached. Ira stepped inside, cloak gathered around her shoulders. Her hair was braided loosely, hastily, but her eyes were sharp, alert. You didn't leave this room, did you? She asked gently. Aldrich offered a tired half-smile. I walked to the window once. Astonishing, she said, placing fresh parchments on the table. Should I praise you for your commitment to relocation? Don't encourage him, Thane muttered from the wall. He'll claim it was strategic reconnaissance. It was, Aldrich said automatically. Ira snorted. Of the courtyard. And a portion of the western parapet, Aldrich added, which only made Thane roll his eyes. Despite everything, the shadowed mirror of Aldrich's brother, the trembling earth beneath them, their banter temporarily softened the air. It was habit, comfort, a small rebellion against dread. But the reprieve didn't last. We need to talk about last night, Ira said quietly. Aldrich nodded. Thane sheathed his blade with a soft click and crossed the room. They gathered around the map. Ira tapped a small circle inked on the parchment. The figure stood here. You said he recognized you. He didn't hesitate. He spoke to you as if he'd been waiting. Aldrich swallowed. He has been. Ira's brows drew together. For 15 years? Thane folded his arms. You said his death was certain. What changed? Aldrich hesitated for a long moment. Long enough that the candles flickered, as if leaning closer. I buried him myself, Aldrich began, voice low. Or, I thought I did. Ira shifted closer. Explain. Aldrich rested both palms on the table, the wood cool beneath his hands. When we were boys, he and I ventured deeper into the mountain than anyone was supposed to. We found a cavern, smooth as glass, as if carved by hands that weren't human. His eyes unfocused slightly, caught somewhere between now and then. He was always drawn to things that weren't meant to be touched. Old runes. Sealed doors. The forbidden. I followed because he was my brother. The silence in the room grew dense. One day, Aldrich continued, he found a fissure leading to a chasm. He said he heard a voice. The muscles in Aldrich's jaw tightened. It whispered to him. Promised him power. Promised he could rise above father. Above the citadel. Above me. Thane exhaled sharply. And he believed it? Aldrich nodded. He stepped toward the chasm. Too close. The ground collapsed beneath him. The memory tightened his chest, even now. I reached for him. Our hands almost touched. And then he fell. Ira placed a steadying hand on his arm. You searched? She asked softly. For days, Aldrich's voice cracked. But the chasm was bottomless. No rope could reach. No sound came from below. And you think something kept him alive, she whispered. Aldrich didn't answer immediately. It didn't just keep him alive, he finally said. It changed him. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, as though the mountain itself shivered at the memory. Thane broke the silence. So this thing under the citadel, your brother wants it freed. Aldrich nodded. He thinks it belongs to him. Ira's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the map. And what do you think it is? Aldrich hesitated because truth he'd learned long ago was a painful gift. I think, he said slowly, that whatever sleeps beneath us is older than any kingdom on these maps. Older than the citadel. Older than us. Thane tapped the table irritably. Then we stop him. That's the plan, isn't it? Aldrich exhaled, steadying himself. There's more. The tremors, they're coming from the lower catacombs. The sealed ones. Ira's breath hitched. Meaning he's already beneath us. Aldrich met her gaze. Meaning he's already inside the mountain. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then Ira said, "We need to go down there." Aldrich shook his head immediately. "No, it's too dangerous. That's exactly why we have to go." She stepped closer, eyes bright with quiet determination. "If your brother is beneath the mountain, we cannot wait for him to come to us." Thane nodded. "She's right. We need to see what he's doing. Now." Aldrich rubbed a hand across his face. He knew they were right. He also knew he hated it. But before he could respond, a loud knock echoed through the chamber. A sentry entered, breathless. "Commander," tremor detected in the south alcove. The masonry cracked. Something is pushing from the inside. Aldrich's spine stiffened. "Pushing?" "Yes, sir." Ira exchanged a look with Thane. No words needed. It had begun. The descent. The path to the sealed catacombs wound through layers of corridors, each lined with dust-coated torches that flared to life as the three passed. The walls grew colder as they descended, the air denser, tinged with a faint metallic scent, like old blood or ancient iron. Ira shivered. "I don't remember these halls ever being this cold." "They weren't," Aldrich murmured. Thane kept one hand on his sword, the other tracing the wall as the ground sloped downward. "How far do these tunnels go?" he asked. Aldrich inhaled sharply. "Farther than recorded. These passages existed long before the citadel was built. Some say the first architects found them and simply built over them." "Helpful," Thane muttered. Love inherited nightmares. They reached a heavy iron gate, its surface etched with runes long faded with age. A crack the size of a man's forearm split the stone beside it, cold air pouring through like a whisper from the deep. Aldrich stepped forward. "I sealed this gate myself years ago." Ira frowned. "And now?" Aldrich ran his fingers over the iron. "It shouldn't be openable," he said. "Not from this side." Thane eyed the crack. Then it wasn't opened. It was forced. Aldrich nodded grimly. From below. The three exchanged a look, the kind that acknowledged fear but refused to bow to it. And Aldrich pressed his palm against the old rune at the gate's center. The gate groaned open. Cold darkness lay beyond. A deep, distant rumble vibrated through the stone. Ira swallowed. "That sounds large." Thane muttered. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that." They stepped inside. The heart of the mountain. The tunnels beyond the gate were ancient, far older than the ones above. Smooth, seamless walls arched overhead, reflecting faint blue light from veins of crystal embedded in the rock. The air felt alive, humming faintly under their breaths. And then they heard it. A voice. Not loud, not clear, but present. A whisper drifting through the tunnels, too faint to distinguish words, but carrying a dangerous, seductive familiarity. Aldrich froze. Ira gently touched his shoulder. "Is it him?" Aldrich nodded once. His voice, but not entirely. Something else is layered with it. They continued forward. Every step carried them deeper, the whisper growing louder, braided with another voice, darker, older, resonant enough to vibrate in their bones. It wasn't speech. It was hunger. They reached an enormous cavern, its ceiling disappearing into darkness, its floor split by a chasm pulsing with faint blue light. And there, standing at the edge, was the figure from the ridge. Aldrich's brother, or whatever he had become. His cloak billowed around him though there was no wind. His skin seemed too pale, too smooth, like marble warmed by something unnatural beneath the surface. Ira's breath caught. Thane whispered, "That's not human." Aldrich stepped forward. "Brother." The figure turned and smiled. Did you come to watch the world remember me? The reflection asked. Or to watch it crumble? Aldrich's throat tightened. What have you done? What I was chosen to do, the figure whispered. What the mountain has waited for. What lies beneath will rise. And you, brother mine, you will finally understand what it means to kneel. The chasm pulsed, once, twice, like a heartbeat. Aldrich reached for his sword, but froze when the cavern floor trembled violently beneath them. Ira grabbed his arm. Aldrich! Thane shouted. It's waking. A roar surged from below, a sound like stones splitting, like the earth itself screaming. A shadow rose from the depths. Enormous, shapeless, filled with ancient will. And Aldrich realized, with a sickening jolt, that his brother had not been changed by the darkness. He had invited it. The cavern shook violently. A massive claw, made of crystal, stone, and swirling void, gripped the chasm's edge. The creature was climbing. Aldrich turned to Ira and Thane, voice raw. We run. They fled. Through tunnel after tunnel, each shaking harder than the last. Dust rained from the ceiling. Cracks spidered along the walls. The mountain groaned in protest. Behind them, a roar echoed through the stone. A roar that did not belong in the world of living things. Bursting through the iron gate, Aldrich slammed it shut and secured the rune. The walls shook violently, but held for now. Ira gasped for breath. Thane braced himself against the wall, hand over his chest. Aldrich stared at the sealed gate, breath ragged. He's awakened it, he whispered. And for the first time since the collapse of the Grey Citadel. Aldrich looked genuinely afraid. If you stood in that cavern and saw Aldrich's brother calling something ancient from the chasm, would you try to reason with him, fight him, or flee and regroup? And what do you think the creature truly is? A god, a monster, or something else entirely? They didn't speak for a long while after sealing the gate. It wasn't silence born of calm. It was the kind stitched from shock and breathlessness, the kind that hung over them like dust suspended after a collapse. The echo of that thing, the claws scraping stone, the cavern trembling with its hunger, still pulsed faintly in the walls. Ira was the first to move. She pushed her hair from her face, hands trembling just slightly, and looked at Aldrich. We can't stay down here. Aldrich nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the sealed gate, as if he expected it to splinter at any moment. Part of him feared it. Another part almost expected it, as though after all these years, the mountain had grown tired of keeping its secrets. Thane let out a long, low breath. Whatever that thing is, it's not going to stop. Aldrich said nothing, which was answer enough. They began the ascent back toward the upper corridors, the air growing less cold and less heavy with each step. Somewhere far above, faint sunlight pressed through the arrow slits, though it did little to warm the stone. The citadel seemed to sense what had awakened beneath it, and the halls felt unsettled, like a body bracing against an internal fever. When they reached the main stair, Ira paused near a narrow window, staring out at the fog-laden mountain slopes. How long do we have? She asked softly. Aldrich leaned beside her. Until the gate breaks, or the mountain gives way, or my brother finds another path upward. So not long. No, Aldrich admitted, voice low. Thane joined them. I hate to bring this up, but we might want to discuss the people who live here. There are families in the lower quarters. Apprentices. The stables. The healer's barracks. We evacuate them, Ira said firmly. Aldrich hesitated. Evacuating the citadel meant admitting to his people that the threat was internal, that the foundation beneath their home, their last stronghold, wasn't stone but something old, alive, and restless. Aldrich exhaled. We'll evacuate them. Quietly. No panic. Thane crossed his arms. Quiet evacuation. Because that always works. Ira shot him a look, though she couldn't hide the faint smile that flickered across her face. Even fear couldn't smother Thane's need to poke at the absurdity of their situation. It was strangely a comfort. They climbed the final steps into the courtyard, greeted by brisk wind and the distant rumble of shifting earth. A few soldiers patrolled the walls, their movements tight with tension, their heads snapping toward the great mountain whenever it gave even the slightest groan. One guard approached immediately. Commander Aldrich, he said, eyes darting. We felt another tremor. It was strong enough to shake loose part of the western parapet. Aldrich exchanged a glance with Ira and Thane before answering. We'll need all high-traffic areas cleared. Quietly. No raised voices. No mention of the lower tunnels. The guard nodded, though confusion furrowed his brow. Yes, sir. Should we prepare the outer gate as well? Not yet, Aldrich said. Keep patrol steady. We'll need time. After the guard jogged off, Thane muttered. You think time's going to obey us? Never, Aldrich said. But it might give us enough space to think. The quiet before nothing. The citadel did not take well to fear. It was old stone, forged on fractures and cooled on legends. It stiffened under stress like a creature lifting its hackles. You could feel it in the walls, listening, holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. Ira began coordinating with the healers first, sending apprentices on quiet errands that conveniently led them out of the lower levels and toward the main square. Thane handled the stables, disguising an evacuation as a relocation drill, something the stable hands grumbled about but ultimately obeyed. Aldrich supervised from the battlements, gaze drawn repeatedly to the mountain like a needle to a lodestone. The tremors were becoming more frequent now, smaller but rhythmic, like breathing. The creature was adjusting, awakening, testing its prison. And somewhere beneath all that, Aldrich's brother waited, calm, patient, confident. That confidence disturbed Aldrich more than anything else. As the afternoon dragged toward dusk, Ira climbed the battlements to join him. Her cloak fluttered in the wind, and though she looked tired, determination still lit her eyes. It's working, she told him. Slowly, but people are moving. We might have a few hours before they notice anything's wrong. Good, Aldrich said, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Ira leaned on the stone beside him. You're thinking about him. Aldrich let out a soft, humorless laugh. Which him? She raised a brow. Your brother. Yes. You blame yourself. I do. Ira's voice gentled. Aldrich, you were boys. You couldn't have stopped the mountain from claiming him. But I followed him, Aldrich said quietly. I always followed him, even when he chased darker things, even when the mountain whispered to him. Ira touched his hand lightly. Some people walk into the dark because they want to, not because you led them. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since the cavern, the ice around his chest cracked. Then the mountain shifted again. But this time the tremor wasn't below. It rolled across the land like a wave, rattling towers and sending dust from the rooftops. The citadel held. Barely. Thane appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, breath short. That wasn't a normal tremor. That felt like an impact, Aldrich finished grimly. Ira frowned. From inside the mountain? Aldrich nodded. It's striking its prison. Thane dragged a hand down his face. Wonderful. Ira steadied herself. We can't just wait. We need a plan. And unfortunately, Aldrich said, we may have only one. The old library. The deepest knowledge of the citadel didn't lie with its mages or generals. It slept in dust, in parchment, in forgotten rooms. And so Aldrich led Ira and Thane toward the old library, an ancient archive behind ironwood doors engraved with crests older than the kingdom itself. The hinges groaned as he pushed the doors open. The smell of parchment and old stone washed over them, strangely comforting. Ira whispered, I haven't been down here since I was a child. Most haven't, Aldrich said. Some of the books are too fragile to move. Some we chose not to disturb. Thane raised a brow. Those are exactly the books we need, aren't they? Aldrich gave him a pointed look. Yes. They moved slowly between towering shelves, torchlight flickering across yellowed spines. The deeper they went, the more the air changed, colder, sharper, faintly humming with old magic. Finally, they arrived at the far back table where scrolls lay bound with cords of ash-gray thread. Aldrich pulled one free. The seal was the same shape as the rune on the gate. Ira leaned closer. This was written by the first archivists. Aldrich nodded. And they were the ones who discovered the caverns beneath the mountain. He untied the cord. The parchment unfurled slowly, revealing ink that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. Words written in a script that wavered as though alive. Thane grimaced. I'm assuming this isn't a bedtime story. In a way, Aldrich said quietly. It's about the thing beneath the mountain. Ira swallowed. Read it. Aldrich did. At least he tried. The language twisted the tongue and resisted comprehension. But he could understand the fragments, enough to paint a terrible picture. A being made of hunger and memory, he murmured. Bound by the mountain itself. Not from this world. Not from any world shaped by men. Ira paled. Bound because it cannot die? No, Aldrich said softly. Because if it dies here, the force released would tear the mountain apart. Thane stared at the parchment. So if the creature escapes, we lose the citadel. But if we kill it, we lose the citadel. Aldrich nodded bleakly. Essentially, Ira whispered. Is there anything we can do? Aldrich scanned the next lines. There's something, he said, hesitation thick in his voice. A ritual. A binding that requires someone to act as an anchor. Thane frowned. Anchor. A living tether, Aldrich explained. Someone who ties the creature's essence to the mountain so it cannot shift forms again. Ira's face drained. Aldrich, that would destroy whoever performed the ritual. Aldrich lowered the parchment. Yes. Thane's expression hardened. No. Aldrich looked at him. We might not have a choice. That's not a solution, Thane snapped. That's a sacrifice. Ira stepped between them before the tension could spike further. We're not deciding anything now. Not until we know exactly what it requires. She turned to Aldrich. What else does it say? Aldrich read silently for a long moment. Then he spoke. It says the anchor must share blood with the one who awakened the creature. Ira froze. Thane whispered, Aldrich. Aldrich closed his eyes. It has to be me. The mountain rumbled again, louder this time. As though agreeing. If you discovered the only way to stop a rising ancient creature was by sacrificing someone with its bloodline, would you accept that burden yourself, or search desperately for another way? And do you think Aldrich should follow the ritual, or try something far more dangerous? It sounded alive. The scribe who should not have been there. They reached the great hall, expecting emptiness. Instead, they found a lone figure seated at the long wooden table. Quill in hand, parchment unfurled, candlelit face bowed over his work. A scribe. A very familiar scribe. Uriah gasped. Aldwine. That's impossible. And indeed it was. Because the man sitting before them was Brother Marchin. Brother Marchin, who they had last seen in Part 5, buried under the collapsed tower. Brother Marchin, whose final breath had been witnessed by 2 others. Brother Marchin, who had most definitely been dead for 3 days. Yet here he was calmly writing. The monk looked up at their approach. His expression was serene, peaceful, unblinking. Oh, he said, as if seeing them was the most ordinary thing in the world. You finally arrived. Uriah stumbled back. You're dead. We buried you. Marchin tilted his head. Did you? How thoughtful. Aldwine took a step forward. What are you writing? Marchin smiled. A smile that did not reach his eyes. Your story, Brother Aldwine. Every line of it. Every step. Every mistake. Every truth you try to hide even from yourself. A cold ripple went down Aldwine's spine. Because the parchment in front of Marchin contained not just words. It contained events. Recent events. Their events. In perfect, meticulous handwriting. The castle that records. Marchin, if that was truly who or what he had become, lifted his quill. Montferrant preserves what others forget, he said softly. It remembers everything. It writes everything. Even the things you never speak aloud. Uriah shakily reached for her dagger. Leave the castle, Marchin said gently, and I remain. Stay in the castle, he leaned forward. And you become part of the writing. A curse, Aldwine whispered. Marchin nodded. A very old one. He tapped the parchment. You've been in this story far longer than you realize. The choices no one wanted. Aldwine grabbed Uriah's arm and pulled her toward the side corridor. They ran. Behind them, Marchin's voice echoed through the hall. You cannot outrun ink, Brother Aldwine. Which, for the record, is the kind of threat that would unsettle even the bravest person, because no one wants to be defeated by office supplies. The corridor twisted sharply, slanting at an angle that made no architectural sense. The walls seemed too narrow, then too wide, then too tall, then too short. The space warped around them like a fever dream. Uriah pressed one hand to the wall. This place isn't built, she whispered. It's alive. Aldwine didn't disagree. The stones vibrated faintly beneath their palms. They turned a corner and stopped dead, because there, blocking the doorway, was a massive figure cloaked in shadow. Not Marchin, not human, but familiar. A shape they had glimpsed only once before, in Part 3, deep beneath the monastery, in the chamber they were never supposed to enter. The Watcher, still faceless, still towering, still impossibly silent. Uriah froze in terror. Aldwine felt his throat tighten. The Watcher extended a hand, not in aggression but in invitation. Aldwine swallowed hard. Why here? He whispered. And for the first time, the Watcher moved its head as if acknowledging him. In a voice that sounded like stone grinding against stone, it spoke. Because this is where your story converges. The threads pulled tight. The storm outside roared. The castle trembled, not with collapse, but with awakening. Montferrand was revealing its purpose. Aldwine realized something then, something horrifying, something inevitable. They were never avoiding the truth. They had been walking toward it the entire time. The manuscript from Part 2. The vault in Part 3. The destroyed tower in Part 5. The last words of the dying messenger in Part 7. The storm that herded them toward this place in Part 8. All of it was pulling them toward this moment. The Watcher wasn't hunting them. It was guiding them. Urea gripped Aldwine's sleeve. I don't want to go in there. Neither do I. But some stories demand to be finished. The Watcher stepped aside. Beyond the doorway was a spiral staircase descending into darkness, deep, ancient, and humming with power. Aldwine lifted his torch. Stay behind me, he murmured. Urea nodded. They stepped forward, and Montferrand closed the door behind them. The stairway that leads backward. The stairs wound downward for far longer than a cliffside castle should reasonably allow. They passed archways older than the stone around them, carvings in languages neither recognized, and alcoves containing objects that might once have been relics or warnings. At last, they reached the bottom. The chamber was circular, vast, lit by an eerie bluish glow that seemed to come from the stones themselves. At its center stood a table of black stone. On the table lay a manuscript, bound in iron, locked with 3 clasps. And yet, open. Aldwine approached slowly. The words on the pages shifted like ripples on water. Urea clutched his arm. Aldwine, that's your handwriting. He stared, horrified. Because she was right. It was. Line after line written in his own script. Words he had never written. Events he had never experienced. Prophecies he didn't understand. The castle had not been recording their past. It had been writing their future. And the next line, forming before their eyes, read. He reached for the book. Urea screamed. Aldwine, don't. But the ink was already writing. And he touched it. His fingertips brushed the page. And everything went dark. If you found yourself in a place like Montferrand, where the walls remember, the ink predicts, and the castle writes your future, would you read ahead or refuse to know what comes next? The storm that had been threatening the horizon finally broke sometime after midnight. I'm sure you remember, from the end of Part 8, how we left poor brother Aldwine and Lady Urea standing in the courtyard of Montferrand Castle, staring up at a structure that should not, by any reasonable architectural standards, still be standing. The air crackled with the kind of uneasy tension that only appears when history is about to tell you something it would very much prefer you didn't ask about. And so, naturally, we're going to ask about it anyway. Because Montferrand Castle was wrong. Not a little odd, not quirky, but structurally, spiritually, metaphysically wrong. And everyone in the 13th century knew it. The castle that defied every rule of the age. When historians first set eyes on the ruins of Montferrand in the 19th century, they were puzzled by the same question the medieval monks had been whispering about. How did this thing still stand? You must understand something. Most castles of the early 1200s collapsed at least once. Not because of warfare, but because medieval construction involved optimism, timber that had seen better days, mortar made by men who had no intention of following instructions, and as always, God's will. Montferrand, however, was built into the side of a cliff that looked ready to crumble on its own. And yet the castle clung to the rock like a stubborn barnacle with a vendetta. So by the time Aldwine and Lady Urea arrived, drenched from the rain and exhausted from the ordeal of Part 8, they were staring at a massive structure that seemed to warp the air around it. You know, a building is suspicious when even the gargoyles look concerned. The torches flickered. The wind hissed through the cracks. Something inside the walls shifted, something large. Urea tightened her cloak. Aldwine, this place, it feels wrong. The monk nodded slowly. We are in agreement, which, if you've been following along since Part 1, is truly remarkable because these two barely agreed on the color of the sky. The legend of the architect. To understand what was about to happen inside Montferrand, you need to hear the oldest legend surrounding it. It began with a mason, but of course it did, because no medieval ghost story is complete without an artisan who was either A, too good at his job, or B, far too good at pretending he was good at his job. In the case of Montferrand's enigmatic builder, Master Armand du Lys, the chroniclers reluctantly agreed he fell into category A, annoyingly competent. According to local tales, Armand did everything right, and yet everything went wrong. A noble hired him to reinforce an inherited castle that had been decaying for 2 generations. Armand studied the foundations, shook his head in horror, and declared the entire place structurally unsalvageable. The noble, like most men with hereditary titles and questionable reality awareness, refused to accept this. "Build it again," he ordered. "Upon what, my lord?" Armand asked. "A miracle?" "Exactly. This, dear listener, is what historians call a red flag. Armand rebuilt the castle anyway, because craftsmen needed work, and because arguing with nobles rarely resulted in job security or a continued attachment to one's head. He reinforced the walls with a technique unknown elsewhere in Europe, layered the stones in a curious spiral pattern, and carved strange designs into the buttresses that no one could identify. The result? A fortress that should have toppled under its own weight, but didn't. A fortress that survived storms that toppled stronger ones. A fortress whose architecture modern engineers still argue about. A fortress that defied the laws of physics, and, as we will soon see, a few other laws as well. The threshold of impossibilities. Aldwine stepped through the entry hall first. The moment he crossed the threshold, his torch sputtered, not from wind, but from something else. A pressure, a weight, a presence. He had felt this once before in the archives of Part 2, when he touched the sealed parchment that had nearly burned straight through his palms. You remember the one written by a scribe who claimed he'd seen the eye beneath the altar, which is never a comforting thing for anyone to write, least of all in decorative marginalia. Montferrand held that same kind of wrongness. Urea entered behind him. Her footsteps echoed too loudly, as if the hall were amplifying them. She glanced upward at the massive vaulted ceiling. "Brother Aldwine, did you hear that?" Unfortunately, yes, because in the shadows above them, something shifted again. But this time, it didn't sound architectural. And so, as Aldwine's footsteps fade into whatever space lies beyond that last impossible doorway, we find ourselves drifting gently back toward the world where the candlelight isn't enchanted. Books don't rearrange your destiny, and the most ominous thing in a library is usually the late fee. The echoes of Montferrand soften, the stone settles, and the dark, watchful halls release us with the same reluctant sigh a medieval scribe might give after copying another 50 pages without a single complaint. The strange rules, the stranger guardians, the scribes who wrote without eyes, the architect who built a castle like a puzzle designed to confuse future generations. All of it slowly folds back into whatever corner of time it belongs to. And here we are again. You, with your blanket pulled up just a little higher. Me, with a voice that's probably grown slower and sleepier than either of us expected. And the night, stretching quietly around both of us like a medieval tapestry that forgot to include the part where the knights fight each other. If you're still awake, congratulations. Truly, you have outlasted monks, curses, architects, scribes, and at least one very stubborn medieval book. And if you're half asleep, or fully asleep and somehow still hearing this, well, that's fine too. That's kind of the whole point of these late-night wanderings. Before we part ways for the evening, I want to thank you for listening, for wandering through dim corridors and echoing chambers with me, and for sticking around through every strange medieval rule that somehow made perfect sense to the people who lived under them. History is a long, winding hallway filled with locked doors, missing keys, and the occasional cursed manuscript. And it's always more fun to explore it together. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, whether it kept you awake in a cozy way or carried you straight into sleep, feel free to tap the like button. If you want to join me again for more soft, rambling, questionably structured medieval mysteries and quietly dramatic human disasters, you can subscribe too. And if there was one rule, one character, or one moment tonight that stuck with you, tell me in the comments. I always love reading which parts stayed with you, even after your eyelids got heavy. For now, settle in, take a slow breath, and let the last remnants of Montferrand fade into quiet. Sleep well, traveler. Until the next journey.